Hi folks! On today's video we're going to be discussing the Buddhist notion of awakening. What is it? Okay, I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And today we're going to be discussing the early Buddhist notion of awakening. I think a lot of people have questions about what it might mean, particularly within a secular Buddhist context. And so we'll try to unpack some of that. Some of you will be familiar with this kind of image of, I think you can see that, the Buddha with his hand here in what's called the Bhumisprisha Mudra, or the earth-touching gesture. The Buddha is calling the earth to witness his awakening. That is probably the most iconic representation of Buddhist awakening. And you'll see it everywhere if you go to any kind of a museum and look at early Buddhist art. That goes way back, although it does not go back anywhere near to the Buddha's lifetime. Those images are centuries later. And indeed, there's nothing in the earliest stratum of texts about this particular image either. So there's nothing about him actually touching the ground after awakening. What does it mean to achieve awakening? Now, obviously, there's a traditional understanding of awakening where it ends the cycle of rebirths, and that's clearly very important in the early tradition. It's important in many religious forms of Buddhism today. But there are other aspects I think that will be of more interest to this life kind of interpretation, because what's important in achieving awakening is the uprooting or the overcoming of the three what are called asavas. It's a word that originally comes from Jainism, which is a different tradition, but basically it means something like it means either influxes or outflows, but that's a word that really doesn't have any resonance to us. Some people translate it as taints, which again is not a great translation. Let's just call them negative tendencies. We have certain negative tendencies that plague us throughout our lives. And these come in three general categories. I'll go through them one by one. The first one is called in Pali kamasava. That is to say, the desire is a desire for pleasure, for achieving pleasurable sensations. And the flip side of that, a desire to avoid painful sensations. This kind of desire is perfectly natural. There's nothing unnatural about it. However, it can become a problem as those desires turn into what we might call greed and hatred. And so the negative tendencies here with the first asava, or the first one of these, should be seen as greed and hatred. We have to be careful here because there are perfectly healthy kinds of desires along these lines. People will say, well, look, the Buddha or anybody who's awakened is clearly going to want to eat, is going to want to drink. Anyone who is awakened is also going to not like certain things. They're going to not like injustice. They're going to not like people hurting each other. That's perfectly fine within this context. That should be seen as healthy desires. Whereas what we're discussing here with awakening is the overcoming of unhealthy desires, the unhealthy greed, the greed for things that we don't really need to survive, but just because we have a sense of ego and we want to feed that ego, and we want an unceasing amount of pleasurable experience within life, and when we don't get it, it causes us pain. Similarly, our dislike of injustice, our dislike of people who hurt other people and so on, that's perfectly healthy, as is our dislike of our own ignorance and so on, perfectly healthy. But when that becomes hatred, when that becomes a desire to see other people injured, to see other people fare badly, then it's a problem. And so that would be the flip side. That's part of what we call the first of these asavas, or the first of these negative tendencies, is this sort of two-part issue of greed and hatred. The second negative tendency is called in the Pali bhavasava. It's a desire for being. Let's put it this way. The best way to understand it is that there's a desire for immortality that we have, a desire never to die. We don't want to experience death. We don't want to die. We don't want to cease existence. The flip side of that is that some of us may have suicidal tendencies. Some of us may have a desire to die. That is to say, a desire not to exist at all. Both of these should be seen within a Buddhist context as problematic, and it's overcoming this two-sided desire that constitutes part of awakening. So what we should say is the awakened being is one who has perfect equanimity about his or her own death, but at the same time is perfect equanimity and doesn't have any desire to not to exist, or to commit suicide, for instance. They don't. It's somebody who says, if I live or die tomorrow, I'm equanimous with that. I'm okay with that. So that's the second asava, the second of these negative tendencies that we overcome by becoming awakened. The third one is avijjasava, or the negative tendency of ignorance. And in a sense, this third tendency sort of can be thought of as encompassing all three, because all three are forms of ignorance. But more specifically, the ignorance here would be an ignorance of the way the world is. So, for example, one of the ways that we can desire pleasurable experience is through a sort of a belief that there are things that are permanent within life, within the world. That if we only look for that experience that will never leave us, we might be able to obtain permanent pleasure. And that kind of thinking, that kind of thought process, is a form of ignorance within an early Buddhist context that we need to overcome if we're going to become awakened. We need to understand that there is no experience that is permanent, and so therefore, looking for a permanently pleasurable experience, or expecting that any particular experience that we strive for in life, if we expect that to be permanent, we're going to be always disappointed. What we were left with is a form of equanimity towards experience, towards lived experience. That we are equanimous, we're okay with the fact that sometimes things are pleasurable, sometimes things are painful, that we're going to die someday, we're going to get sick, we're going to get old, and that constitutes awakening from a Buddhist context. Now, one question that I think some people may have is this really achievable? Within early Buddhism, it was believed, and many Buddhists believe today, that this is achievable in a perfect sense. That is, one can be completely devoid of greed. One can be completely devoid of hatred permanently. Is this possible? I don't know. I think it's perhaps an empirical question. But what is important, and I think most important to stress, is that I think it is possible to get farther down this path. There may not be an end to it, but nevertheless, through practice and through insight into our own kind of lived experience, we can come to a better relationship with greed, with hatred, such that we understand their problems, and such that we make a kind of effort through various techniques of meditation and so on to try to minimize them as much as possible. I should probably at the end say a word about the Bodhisattva ideal. Bodhisattva ideal comes out of Mahayana Buddhism, which is a slightly later school of Buddhism than the very earliest material. And the general idea was that there are a group of beings, and we may desire to be them ourselves or strive to be them ourselves, in which we put aside awakening in order to spend time helping others to achieve awakening. So in this context, this context is best seen, I think, if we're talking about traditional kinds of ideas of Buddhism. That is to say, traditionally, when one becomes awakened, one overcomes the cycle of birth and death. One ceases to be reborn. Understood that way, the bodhisattva is a person who decides not to become awakened in order to be reborn, so that they can be reborn in future lifetimes to help other people. There are many theories about the origins of the Mahayana, and some of these theories are that some of the idea of the bodhisattva ideal may have grown out of a kind of sorrow for having lost the founder of the tradition, Siddhartha Gautama, and a feeling of needing his presence around. And so the notion of the bodhisattva ideal came out of this notion that people who are of very, very high states of mind can be reborn in future lifetimes and be with us, and that perhaps the Buddha himself, in a sense, is still with us. This is probably more, at least from my own perspective, a more religious take on Buddhism than perhaps may be appropriate for many secular believers, or secular practitioners, but everyone's different. Everyone will come with their own interests. And certainly nowadays, engaged Buddhism and an idea that Buddhism should make an effect in this world, not simply on one's own inner states, but on the states of politics and society around us, the Bodhisattva ideal takes a different resonance on, as being not so much that you aren't reborn, but rather that your focus is not exclusively upon your own greed and hatred, but is also externalized onto helping alleviate the greed and hatred in the world. So I think this is a good way of understanding awakening, both within an early Buddhist context, in which it has to do with overcoming of greed, hatred, and a desire for immortality or non-existence, and also an understanding of awakening within a later Mahayana context, where it also takes on more issues of social change in the modern world. So thanks very much for watching. Please put any comments you have, questions down in the comment section below, and any topics you'd like me to cover in future videos. I'm always thrilled to hear your ideas for what you want to watch. And see you next time.